Hello, everyone, and welcome to Tales from the Silk Road Festival. The story I'm going to tell you is from the book of 1001 Nights, or also known as the Arabian Nights. It happens in Old Persia, which is today Iran, and is located on Silk Road, an ancient commercial road that started in China and India and continued through Iran, Afghanistan, and many other countries, and reached Europe, near Genoa and Venice, I believe, in Italy. Hence the connection to Tales from the Silk Road. Now, I heard this story as a child, and I loved it so much that when I grew up, I told it to my nieces and nephews, and they enjoyed it very much. I hope you like it too. Once upon a time, there was a Persian king who had a very strange habit. Every so often at night, he would take off his royal crown that had jewels, rubies, and emeralds and diamonds, and he would take off his royal robe, which was sewn with gold threads and hemmed with precious pearls, and put on ordinary clothes like you and me, and go out into the streets of his kingdom. On these outings, he was always accompanied by his Grand Vizier. Do you know who that is? Like a prime minister. He was a very, very wise man. One night, when they were in a very poor neighborhood of the town, the king saw light coming from a window. He peeked and saw 3 girls sitting on cushions and chatting. The first one, who looked the oldest, said, "Oh, I wish to be married to the king's baker. Then I can have all those fresh hot breads, all those pastries, all those sweets and candies." The second one said, "No, I wish to be married to the head chef at the king's palace, because then I can have all the breads and pastries and cookies and whatnot, but also those saffron rice and sumptuous stews and delicious tender meats and vegetables." The third one, who looked the youngest and the most beautiful, said, "Actually, I like to be married to the king himself." The other 2 laughed at her, mocked her. But she said, "You know, as the queen, I can have all those things, but I can also, if the king wishes, help him in running the affairs of his kingdom." The king was very charmed by all this, but didn't say anything. He went back to his palace, and the following morning, he put on his crown, he put on his robe, sat on his throne, and called the girls in. They were trembling with fear. What have we done? What did we do wrong? The king said, "Do not fear. Last night, we heard your wishes." That's how kings talk about themselves. They say, "we." The girls' cheeks turned red, and they cast their eyes down. They were embarrassed. But the king said, "I'm going to grant your wishes. You," he said to the eldest, "are going to be married to my baker. You are going to be married to my head chef. And to the youngest, he said, you are going to be the queen." And that's what happened. 3 weddings were set up, one nicer than the next, and the 3 sisters married the people they had wished for. All weddings were very nice, as I said, but obviously the king and the queens were the most glamorous, the most luxurious. After all, their youngest sister had the queen's throne, and the crown, and the robes, and her wedding gown. The tale went on, and it was sewn with gold threads and hemmed with precious pearls and stones. The 2 sisters didn't like that. Why should she be the queen? Why should she have the crown? Why should she be with the king? Why this, why that? They were very, very jealous. But they pretended that they were happy for the younger sister. And they said that how much they loved her. 1 year passed. The queen gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. The sisters, being the closest to the queen, were right beside her. They didn't like that. they grabbed the baby, they put him in a basket, and they let him on the river that ran outside the palace. And they came back to the king and said, "Your Majesty, we wish we didn't have to say this, but your queen has given birth to a puppy." "A dog?" the king roared. "Yes, Your Majesty." The king was furious. He wanted to punish the queen. But the Grand Vizier, being so wise, intercepted and said, "Your Excellency, the queen has shown nothing but dignity and grace. Why should we imagine she is a witch or something? There must be an explanation. Give her another chance." And the king, because he loved the queen so much, agreed. Now, the little boy, not knowing anything, was happily floating on the river when the keeper of the gardens of the palace saw him. He grabbed the basket, and he had never himself had a child. He and his wife had been married for years and never had a child of their own. So he was the happiest to see this beautiful baby boy, not even a day old. His features were so nicely defined. He took the baby to his wife and said, "Look, after all these years, God has granted our wish, and now we have a son." Now, they looked into a book that had the names of all past princesses and princes and kings and picked the name Bahman for him. And they loved him like their own. Another year passed. The queen gave birth to another baby boy. The jealous sisters were standing right beside her, and they grabbed the baby, they put him in a basket, and they let him on the river that ran outside the palace. And they came back to the king and said, "Your Majesty, we wish we didn't have to tell this. Your queen, this time, has given birth to a kitten." "A cat?" the king roared. How could the queen give birth to cats and dogs unless she wasn't a witch? But the Grand Vizier intercepted and asked for another chance for the queen. And the king agreed. Now, the little boy was happily floating on the river when the keeper of the gardens of the palace, naturally always by the river, saw him and took him. Another boy for him. He took him to his wife and said, "Look, our baby boy has a brother now." They looked at the book and they picked the name Parviz for him. And they loved these boys like their own. Another year passed, and the queen this time gave birth to a beautiful, bright baby girl. The jealous sisters grabbed the baby, put her in a basket, and let it run on the river that ran outside the palace. And came back to the king and said, "We don't know how to say this, Your Excellency. Your queen has given birth to a stick of wood." And they produced a stick, which they had picked up on their way to the palace. And the king, not knowing what to do, could he go back to his kingdom and say the queen is giving birth to cats and dogs and wood? No. He punished the queen. He ordered that she go out of the palace, live in a shed that was dark and damp and filthy, and banned everyone from even saying a word to her. So the poor queen sat there day and night, crying her heart out, not knowing what to do, what happened to her children. Now, the little baby girl was happily floating on the river when the keeper of the gardens of the palace saw her and grabbed her and took her to his wife. "Look now we have a daughter. Could anyone be happier than us at this moment?" And they loved these children like their own. As soon as they were growing up a little bit, they got them tutors. They taught them language, they taught them mathematics, they taught them literature. When they were old enough to get on a pony or something, they got them masters to teach them horse riding and javelin throwing and archery. Parizad, the girl, the youngest, was the most clever and very agile. She could beat her brothers in horse racing and even javelin throwing. And without knowing anything about their past, they were growing up very happily with the gardener and his wife. Until the wife of the gardener passed away, and he decided to retire. So he went to the king and asked permission to leave. And the king, being very happy with his services, gave him a very big reward. And the gardener spent all that money in building a house, magnificent, outside the palace grounds, but a house that lacked nothing, it seemed, with lots of hunting grounds, because that's what people do at that time. And he and his children lived there very happily for 6 months. But then one night, he became very ill and then died in his sleep, without ever having a chance to tell these children who they actually were. The children made the most respectable funeral for their father and mourned him like he was their own father. And then continued to live in that house very happily, until one day an old woman came to the door and asked for a glass of water. Parizad, being very kind and hospitable and gracious, invited her in and offered her sorbet and food and everything, and they sat and chatted. They talked about the house a lot, and the old woman said, "You know, this house is truly splendid, except for 3 things." "What are they?" Parizad asked. "Oh, if you only had the speaking bird, which has the wisdom of the whole universe, and the singing tree, each leaf on this tree flutters and acts like a musical instrument, and they all together play like the most amazing orchestra, and they draw all sorts of birds. And then the last is the silver water. If you pour even a drop of it into a basin, it fills the basin, it turns up and makes the most delightful fountain, but it never overflows." "How can I get these things? I didn't know they existed," Parizad said. "Oh, it's easy. There is a path outside your home. Take that path and ride for 20 days. And ask the first person you see." And with that, she said goodbye and left. But Parizad couldn't take these things out of her head. When her brothers came home, they noticed she wasn't her usual cheerful person. "What is it? What happened to you? What's wrong?" They kept asking, until Parizad told them the whole story. "All this time, I thought our house was perfect," she said. "But now I realize we are lacking these things." "No problem. Don't fret. I'll go and get those things for you," Bahman, the eldest brother, said. And with that, he started preparing for the trip. Before he left, he gave them a knife and said, "Every day, look at the blade. If it is bright and shiny, then I'm fine. If it is blood-stained, then something has happened to me." With that, Parizad was so afraid and said, "Please, please, I don't want anything. Don't go." But Bahman said, "I'll be back before you know it. I'll just go and get those things for you and come back." And he got on his horse and rode for 20 days until he saw a very old man under the shade of a very large tree. He got off his horse, he paid his respect, and asked the man how he could get these things. The old man tried very hard to convince him not to go. He said, "So many people before you have gone and never returned. They all have turned into stone statues. Please listen to me and don't go." But Bahman wouldn't hear of it. He wanted to get these things for his sister. So then the old man gave him a bowl and said, "Get on your horse, throw this bowl, and follow it. When you reach the foot of a mountain, get off your horse and go up. Whatever you do, don't turn around, because then you will be turned into a stone statue." And Bahman said, "That's easy enough. I'll just do it." So he thanked the old man, he got the ball, he got on his horse, he threw the ball, it rolled, and Bahman followed it until he reached the foot of a mountain. He got off his horse and started climbing. Nothing happened. More. Nothing happened. And then he heard these murmurs and whispers. And then they became sounds and voices. And then shouts and screams and shrieks. Grab him! Kill him! Murderer! Thief! Bahman's knees began wobbling, and he turned around. And there it was, stone statue. Back at home, Parizad and Parviz were looking at the blade when they saw there was a blood stain on it, and they knew something has happened to their brother. So Parviz decided to go after him. And before he left, he gave his sister a string of pearls and said, every day, run these. If they turn, it means I'm okay. If they stay fixed, something has happened to me. And with that, he left. He rode for 20 days and reached the same old man who was sitting under the shade of a very large tree. He got off his horse, he paid his respect, and asked how he could get these things. Once again, the old man tried to convince him not to go, but it didn't work. And he told him how he could get there and what he should do. And it seemed quite easy to Parviz. He said goodbye, took the ball, got on his horse, threw it. It rolled and rolled and rolled until it reached the foot of a mountain. He got off his horse and started climbing. He did see statues, the silence, and it was quite frightening. But he continued among the statues going up, and nothing happened until he started hearing these murmurs and whispers. And then they became voices and sounds, and then shrieks and cries and frying. Don't go! Grab him! Kill him! He's a burglar! He's a thief! And he, being so dignified, he had never heard such bad language. He drew his sword and turned around. And there it was, stone statue. Back at home, Parizad was turning the beads when she saw they were fixed. They weren't moving. So she knew something has happened to her brother. She changed her clothes into men's clothes and got on her horse and rode for 20 days until she saw the same old man under the shade of a very large tree. She got off her horse, she paid her respects, and asked, how do I get these things? The silver water, speaking bird, and the singing tree. The old man tried very hard to convince her not to go. But Parizad said, I have to go and save my brothers. And the old man said, if you must go, then go. This is what you are supposed to do. Parizad didn't say, oh, that seems really easy, I'm just going to do it. She thought about it a little bit and said, well, from what I understand, the problem here is those voices and shouts and sounds. So if I can find a solution for that, then I should be okay. And the old man said, so many before you have tried and haven't succeeded, so how can you succeed? And Parizad said, I'll find a solution. She thanked the old man, she got the ball, she threw it. The ball rolled and rolled and rolled, and she followed until she reached the foot of the mountain. And she saw the same stone statues and the silence. She got off her horse, and before going up, she took cotton balls and stuffed her ear, and took more and stuffed the other ear. When she was sure she could hear nothing, then she began climbing. She went up, 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 up. Nothing happened. At the near very top, she heard some buzzing and humming, which didn't bother her. So at the top, she saw a beautiful golden cage and a bird in it. She took out the cotton balls, and before she could speak, the bird said, You are not who you seem to be, but I will tell you about that later. I know why you are here." And she told the girl to go behind the mountain onto a path until she reaches a pond. And from there, she should fill a jar with the silver water. And right beside it, there is a tree, and she should break off a branch from it and bring it back. MariaSaba did just that. And when she came back, she took the cage, and while they were descending the mountain, she sprinkled the statues with this silver water, and they all came to life. And she kept dousing them, and her brothers came back to life. And they hugged and embraced and were so happy. And they all came down the mountain, got on their horses, and left for home. When they were fairly close to their home, they noticed King and his men. Apparently, they had come hunting on that day, and they saw the nice hunting ground and came to see. They got off their horse, they paid their respects, and the king immediately liked them and thought, if only these were my children. The children asked him to come to their place to rest and have something, have a meal with them. And the king liked them so much that he agreed. So they all went home. And the first thing MariaSaba did was she went to the garden, she poured the silver water into a basin. It filled but didn't overflow. And suddenly a huge fountain rose, the most refreshing and delightful thing. And she planted the branch right beside that fountain. And it immediately grew into this huge tree with thousands of leaves fluttering and playing music, and amazing birds came to sit on them. And then the bird said, "Now, I want you to make a special meal for the king." "Oh, the cook is preparing everything," MariaSaba said. "No, I want you to make a special dish just for the king. You are going to take a cucumber, and you are stuffing it with pearls." That seemed strange enough, but MariaSaba had no reason not to trust the bird. So she took a cucumber, she stuffed it with pearls, put it on a very nice platter, and took it to the king. Before he started eating, said, "This is a special dish for you." The king looked at the cucumber, but didn't say anything. He took his knife and cut a slice, and a pearl tumbled onto the plate. He cut another slice. Another pearl tumbled onto the plate. Third, fourth, fifth, and pearls kept tumbling onto the plate. "My dear child," the king said, "you don't expect me to believe that a cucumber can have pearls inside?" Before MariaSaba could say anything, the bird spoke. "Your Excellency, you don't believe a cucumber can have pearls inside, even though you're seeing it with your own eyes. And yet you believed your queen could give birth to a cat and a dog and a stick of wood, even though you didn't see it." "But her own sisters told me so," the king said. And the bird told them the whole story. The king was overjoyed to have found his children, but also very sad because of what had happened to the queen, and very, very angry, you know with whom. So he took his children, and they went back to the palace. From there, on foot, he went to the shed, and that's a big thing for a king, and fell on Queen's feet, and told her the whole story, and begged for forgiveness. The queen, who was overjoyed to have her children back, and now knew what had happened, granted forgiveness, and came back with him to the palace. Now the king knew very well that sooner or later, the sisters would be back to their old tricks. So he banned them not just from the palace, not just from the town, but the whole of the kingdom. And after that, they all lived happily ever after. Thank you.